Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. The university discussion about theology and falsification took place in the mid-20th century, and there were several different participants, perhaps the most important of which, who gets the first word and the last word, is Anthony Flew, and there's two respondents who are particularly important, Hare, Basil Mitchell. All three of them appeal to various parables, that is, stories that can be used as analogies to talk about this issue of whether religious believers, when they're making, assertions, statements, whatever you want to call them, are actually saying something that is genuinely meaningful, or whether there's something else going on. And Flew is going to begin his response to Mitchell and Hare by saying that, let me give you a summary of the challenge that I had expressed. Some theological utterances seem to and are intended to provide one of two things, perhaps both, assertions or explanations, right? And he says that an assertion, to be an assertion at all, must claim that things stand thus and not otherwise. Otherwise, it's not really an assertion. Now, that's interesting because you have a meta-assertion there about assertions, and we're not going to go into the meta thing. But, an assertion claims that things are this way and not another way. Same thing with explanations. They are doing something similar. As he says, an explanation, to be an explanation at all, must explain why this particular thing occurs and not something else. And then he says, those last clauses, and not otherwise is not something else, are crucial, but sophisticated religious people, they are going to refuse to allow not merely that anything actually does occur, but that anything conceivably could occur, which would count against their theological assertions and explanations. So they're saying they can't be falsified. And in doing so, what they end up doing is making all sorts of qualifications, right? And so this means, and it's interesting that he chooses two different terms, that their explanations wind up being bogus and their assertions wind up being vacuous. Now, is there really a difference between the bogus and vacuous here, or is this merely, some embellishment of rhetoric? I kind of think it's the second, but we don't need to worry about that. The main issue is that Flew is saying, listen, you sophisticated religious people or theologians, you make these assertions like God exists, or God created the universe, or God loves us like a father loves his children. And then when there seems to be evidence going against that, you start making all sorts of qualifications that let you keep your statements and to continue to assert them, believe in them, use them as explanations, but they come to no longer mean anything except to you. They're not helpful for the wider public discourse that we're part of. So this is the challenge that Flew raises in his first part. And then Hare and Mitchell both write pieces that are responding to this. Mitchell, who he talks about first, is going to, he says, his response to this challenge is admirably direct, straightforward, and understanding. He agrees that theological utterances must be assertions. He also agrees that if they're going to be assertions, there must be something that would count against their truth. He agrees, too, that believers are in constant danger of transforming their would-be assertions into vacuous formulae. So far, so good. Here's the difference. Flew takes Mitchell as saying that Flew should have made some distinctions about how these assertions actually work. The theologian surely would not deny the fact of pain counts against the assertion that God loves men. This generates the most intractable of theological problems, the problem of evil. And Flew says that's right. I should have made a distinction between two very different ways of dealing with what looks like evidence against the love of God. So the way that I stressed was, as he calls it, the expedient of qualifying the original assertion. So you make a claim that, God loves us, and you're like, well, why do things suck then? Why is this 4-year-old kid dying of cancer in horrible pain? And why are their parents also suffering as a result? How could a God allow that sort of stuff? And then somebody comes along and says, well, you got to understand that, when we say love, we mean something different than what we normally mean by it. And Flew says, well, if you're going to do that, sooner or later, you're not talking about love at all. You're talking about something that has been so qualified, it doesn't really mean anything. It's become a vacuous assertion. Mitchell doesn't go that route. He says that, I stress this way, but the way the theologian usually takes at first is to admit that it looks bad, but to insist that there must be some explanation which will show that in spite of appearances, there really is a God who loves us. So it's providing some kind of explanation for the assertion that does acknowledge there is evidence against the assertion, but says, well, we still have good reason to think so. Now, does that actually get Mitchell's stranger aiding and actually running the resistance in a country for the partisan off the hook? Well, here's where we get to an interesting feature of analogies. They can only be pushed so far before we find some problems with the analogies that are being set up. So if we're going to tell a story about a resistance leader who has some rather ambiguous actions that could be interpreted either way, some of which reaffirm the original assertion, this person actually cares for us, they're looking out for us, some of which seem to go against it, can that logic really apply to God, at least in the way that, as Flew is calling it, sophisticated religious believers think of it? So he says, in Mitchell's parable of the stranger, it's easy for the believer to find plausible excuses, explanations for the ambiguous behavior because the stranger is a man. What about when it's God? God is different than human beings. And Flew is going to point out several important ways, right? We can't say that he would like to help but cannot because God is, according to religious believers, omnipotent. We cannot say that he would help if he only knew. God is omniscient. We cannot say that he's not responsible for the wickedness of others. God creates those others. Indeed, an omnipotent, omniscient God must be an accessory before enduring to the fact that every human misdeed, as well as being responsible for every non-moral defect in the universe. So he says, okay, if you look at it this way, then Mitchell's proposal is going to have to be qualified in a bunch of different ways, and we wind up with the same sort of vacuous assertions subject to the death by 1,000 qualifications that Flew had pointed out in his first article. So, that could go against Mitchell's point of view. Then he turns to Hare. Now, Hare, if you remember, introduced this idea of blicks. He made up a word for it, and blicks are not explanations. Blicks are what underlie explanations and allow them to be regarded as explanations in the first part. So blicks are these non-rational commitments that we have. He gives the example of somebody who has an insane blick that Oxford Dons are out to get him. He's paranoid about that. And no matter what evidence you introduce, he is not going to trust those Oxford Dons. And Hare is trying to say that religious believers and non-religious believers that religion is wrong, atheists, actually have different blicks. So, what is Flew going to say about this? He says that this is not actually going to work. Any attempt to analyze Christian religious utterances as either expressions or assertions of blicks is not going to be helpful, rather than as assertions about the cosmos, is misguided. Why? Well, if you do this sort of thing, then you're going to wind up in some very unorthodox position. If Hare's religion really is a blick involving no cosmological assertions about the nature and activities of a supposed personal creator, how in the hell is Hare a Christian at all, right? There's no doctrinal content there. There's nothing to actually believe in. So that's a big problem, right? Too much baby with the bathwater being thrown out. The other problem, he says, that if we interpret these assertions in this way, they could scarcely do the job that they do. If they were not even intended as assertions, then a lot of religious activities would become either fraudulent or just silly. So he says, if you ought, because it's God's will, asserts no more than you ought, then the person who prefers the formal phraseology is not really giving a reason, but a fraudulent substitute for one. And here he gives a really interesting analogy. A dud check, a check that is written with no money in the account. And he follows this out, and he says that, saying something like, my soul must be immortal because God loves his children, if that asserts no more than my soul must be immortal, the person who reassures himself with theological arguments for immortality is being silly in the same way as somebody who tries to clear his overdraft. He's written checks that he can't actually cover by writing his bank a check on the same account. Now, in real life, if you can actually get away with that, that's because the bank manager is an idiot. But, theological assertions could be like that as well, couldn't they? You're making an argument that's essentially circular or vacuous. So he says religious utterance may indeed express false or bogus assertions, but I don't believe they're not both intended and interpreted to presuppose assertions. So Hare's approach, according to Flew, that's not really going to work either. And then he's going to close this with a very, very interesting suggestion. So he brings up George Orwell's 1984, a book I think we're all at least familiar with. If we haven't read it, we at least know about it. And we're probably familiar with this idea that is expressed there of doublethink. And doublethink, as he puts it, is this power of holding two contradictory beliefs simultaneously and accepting both of them. So you think both A and not A, or B, which implies not A, right? So the contradictory beliefs don't necessarily need to be exact opposites of each other, but they have to imply a contradiction. So the party intellectual knows he's playing tricks with reality, but by the exercise of doublethink, he satisfies himself that reality is not violated. So there's a doublethink of doublethink as well, once you start using doublethink. So Flew is going to say, religious assertion is a lot like that. There is a loving God, and yet at the same time we inhabit a heartless and indifferent world. These should be contradictory to each other. But these are the sort of things that religious believers will in fact say are compatible. So he says perhaps religious intellectuals are sometimes driven to doublethink in order to retain their faith in a loving God in the face of reality of a heartless and indifferent world. But this another time we'll discuss. So he's not going to go into detail about this, but he's suggesting that a lot of religious belief, if it doesn't just fall apart because of death of 1,000 cuts, there's something analogous to doublethink going on within it. So we see that Flew actually does have some responses that he makes to the proposals of Mitchell and Hare for somehow saving religious utterance as not being merely vacuous, not being something to reject because of the death of 1,000 qualifications, but as actually committing somewhere, either in terms of ambiguous assertions that are then explained in some way, and then there's a crisis of faith, that's Mitchell, or with this notion of blicks that somehow underlie our explanations and assertions on the part of Hare.